In the previous life, my husband suddenly had a heart attack and was taken to the hospital by his colleagues. By the time I rushed to the hospital, my husband had already passed away. I was overwhelmed with grief and fainted. When I woke up again, my husband had already been cremated. Before I could even mourn, the loan agency came knocking at my door demanding repayment. That's when I found out my husband had actually owed millions in loans. And I was the sole heir according to my husband's will. 10 years later, I was hunched over picking up trash on the street. But then, I saw my supposedly deceased husband driving a luxury car and laughing with another woman. My husband smiled and dropped a $100 bill, thanking me for my sacrifices. My body was already drained from exhaustion and I dropped dead on the spot. When I opened my eyes again, I was back to the day when my husband had his heart attack. Chapter 1. Rachel, you need to grieve, take care of yourself. We did our best to save him, but Alan's good friend and his attending physician, Daniel, looked deeply regretful, muttering some medical terms I didn't understand. He helped me sit down on the couch. Rachel, maybe you shouldn't look, I'm afraid you won't be able to handle it. I looked at my youthful reflection in the glass opposite, with no scars on my hands from long hours of work. I took a deep breath to confirm that I had indeed been reborn. In my previous life, upon receiving the news of Alan's heart attack, I rushed to the hospital, running 3 red lights but still arrived too late. Holding the death certificate, I cried until I almost fainted. When I woke up, Alan had been cremated, leaving me only a small urn. I held onto it at home, not eating or drinking, only to be visited by lawyers representing various loan companies. It was then that I found out I was the sole inheritor in Alan's will. I tried to gather my financial situation while struggling with my failing body. I discovered that Alan's company had been sold by my mother-in-law Maran, leaving me with millions in debt. The house was quickly auctioned off by the court, and with nowhere to go, I sought help from Maran, who refused to see me. The following days were incredibly difficult, living in a small shed, with debt collectors knocking on my door almost every day. To survive and repay my debts, I worked 4 jobs every day, but even after the court's enforcement, I could only achieve subsistence, enduring sickness without proper care. One day, as I was scavenging through trash, I saw Alan, who had passed away 10 years ago, driving a car and laughing with a woman. I rushed up to get a clear look, and Alan made no effort to hide his identity, mocking my appearance of 70 at 40. Throwing a $100 bill at me in gratitude for my sacrifices over the past decade. Enraged, I made a decision then and there. You pretended to die in the last life, this time, I'll make sure you really die. Chapter 2. Daniel has been urging me to drink water, but when I came to my senses, I didn't drink it. I remembered that in my past life, I fainted right after drinking this glass of water. I'm almost certain that there's something in this water, meant to make me miss Alan's cremation scene. Setting the water glass down, ignoring Daniel's attempts to stop me, I walked over to Alan's bedside. Alan looked rosy, not at all like someone who had just died. It was my foolishness and sorrow in the past life that prevented me from seeing this. Raising my hand, I slapped Alan hard across the face. Alan didn't flinch, probably pretending to be sedated, which was even better for my plan to proceed. Daniel screamed, thinking I had discovered Alan's act. Rachel, you can't be so rough, we can explain this. Thinking of the pain from my past life, tears streamed down my face, but my hand didn't stop. I mercilessly hit Alan all over, causing Daniel to almost explode. I quickly cried out. I told you not to stay up late, you never listen, leaving me alone, what am I supposed to do? Daniel realized I hadn't noticed anything and that hitting was just my way of expressing grief. However, seeing how harshly I was hitting, he was still worried. He stammered. Rachel, go easy on him, Alan will feel pain. I paused, looking at Daniel as if he were a fool. Wouldn't a person who just died not feel pain? Daniel swallowed hard, regretting his words, awkwardly tugging at the corner of his mouth. No, He struggled to find the right words, but I was too tired to argue. I took out my phone and made a call. Yes, I want to donate organs here. He just passed away recently, hurry up. Daniel wanted to intervene but couldn't due to his position, so he quickly sent a message on his phone. Chapter 3. The organ donation team arrived within a few minutes. I put on a sorrowful expression. My husband has always been a kind person. This unexpected death, I want his life to continue, to help more people. The doctor from the donation center shook my hand firmly. I thank you on behalf of those families. May I ask which organs you would like to donate? I glanced at Daniel, sighed. My husband died of a heart attack. Besides his heart, I've donated everything else, even his body to be used for anatomy teaching. Daniel stood in front of the hospital bed. Rachel, you can't do this. Alan never wanted to donate his organs, he told me before. We have to respect Alan's wishes. I wiped away tears. Daniel, I am Alan's wife, I can make this decision. You and Alan are just good friends without any blood relation. Who should have the final say? I think you already know. And if you delay even a minute, it will cause the organs to deteriorate a minute. You're a doctor yourself, don't you want to save lives? Yes, Dr. Daniel, please step aside. The donation center staff also chimed in. How could Daniel step aside? I just contacted Auntie, you should at least let her see Alan one last time. So, he was informing Marian earlier. After a moment's thought, I nodded. Honestly, I never intended to have Alan donate organs because I knew that the moment his chest was opened, they would discover he was still alive. I wasn't trying to expose Alan's fake death, I wanted to make it real. All I did was to force Irene or Marian to reveal themselves. I wanted them to witness Alan's death, but I was at a loss. And this will be evidence for them to turn against me in the future. Chapter 4. Marian ran over anxiously, her perm still intact on her head, looking like she was in the middle of a beauty treatment. She saw Alan still lying peacefully on the hospital bed, and she breathed a sigh of relief. Immediately, she slapped me across the face and said, "You despicable person, you killed my son, and you still want to dissect him? If anyone dares to touch a hair on my son's head today, I will kill their whole family." Marian imperiously drove the organ donation staff out, saying, "No donation, you go harm someone else." Although the organ donation staff felt regretful, they had no choice but to leave. Daniel finally relaxed, covering Alan with a white sheet. Marian sat on the nearby sofa, pointing at me and scolding. "You despicable wench, you don't feel sad when your own husband dies, don't think about quickly cremating him and letting him rest in peace. And still want to be a cadaver instructor, you are letting my son suffer. If you want to be a good person, go donate yourself, you can die now, I will decide to donate all of you." I covered my face, crying. "Mom, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I just wanted to." Before I could finish, Marian slapped me again. "No more thinking, go back now, I'll send my son to the crematorium later." I quieted down, knelt down on the ground, and obediently handed the water Daniel had brought me to Marian. Marian, without suspecting anything, was too nervous and had been talking non-stop, her mouth dry. She drank the water in one go. Daniel tried to stop her, but it was too late. Just a couple of minutes after drinking, Marian fell unconscious. Daniel, who had just dried his cold sweat, immediately started sweating again. He stuttered. "Rachel, you're not thinking of donating organs again, are you?" Chapter 5. I shook my head and laid Marian down on the sofa. "How could that be? My mom said no, so of course I won't continue." Daniel sighed in relief. "Aunt suddenly passing out is worrying, you better take her to the emergency room quickly, I'll personally arrange Alan's cremation." "How can that be? Why bother you with this matter? You're a doctor, you know more than me, you take care of my mom, I'll go for the cremation." With that, I contacted the crematorium directly and had them come over immediately. Daniel kept refusing. "Cremation can wait, let's wait for Aunt to wake up, Alan isn't going anywhere," I said directly. "Daniel, Alan is already dead, a dead person is not as important as a living one. You and Alan were as close as brothers, but you're not sad at all today and keep saying these strange things, what do you really want?" Daniel was as anxious as an ant on a hot pan, trying to wake Marian up, but no matter how much he shook her, she was unresponsive. It wasn't until the crematorium staff had taken Alan away that Daniel couldn't hold back anymore. He grabbed my sleeve, his voice hoarse. Rachel, I think I saw Alan move just now, let's try to save him again. I held up the death certificate to Daniel's face. Daniel, think carefully before you speak, have you considered what the hospital and you would be responsible for if Alan is really alive now? This is called murder, this is playing with lives. I don't know if the hospital can continue operating, but you will definitely be in trouble, so think again, did you really see Alan move? Daniel was at a loss, not knowing how to respond. I coldly laughed, pushed Daniel's hand away, and followed the crematorium van. Daniel sighed and picked up his phone to make a call. Chapter 6. I looked at Alan lying on the stretcher and couldn't help but laugh. The last time I met Alan on the street in my previous life, his face was almost the same as now, showing hardly any signs of aging. I wanted to rush to the car and meet him, to cry about the suffering I endured over the years. It took Alan a long time to barely recognize me with narrowed eyes. He smiled and said, "It's you, how come we haven't seen each other in 10 years? You look older than my grandmother." At that time, with my hoarse voice and hunchback appearance, I indeed didn't look like a 40-year-old person. I stuttered and asked, "Aren't you dead?" Alan, sitting next to Irene, laughed heartily and said, "I faked my death just to get rid of you." Alan didn't finish his sentence, but what else was there for me to not understand? If he had directly asked for a divorce, I wouldn't have refused. However, a direct divorce meant I would get half of his assets, and he would be labeled as an unfaithful husband. Faking his death changed everything. He could leave all the debts to me, transfer all his assets, and start a new life openly with Irene without fear. I was speechless with anger, but Alan seemed eager to continue speaking. He laughed and said, "Actually, when I was in the hospital, I could hear you talking. I will never forget the sound of your crying. I'm really curious, how could you cry like a goose? Honk, 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 it's really funny." As I was collapsing in the midst of this mockery, Irene said, "Honey, isn't she trying to fake an accident? Let's go quickly." Alan also grumbled and drove away without caring about me. My last memory was watching the car drive off, then I fell into darkness. While still immersed in painful memories, I noticed Alan's fingers move slightly. It seemed he knew he was going to be cremated, and with the anesthesia wearing off, he began to awaken. I urged the driver. "Sir, please hurry, my mother-in-law wants to snatch my husband's body to donate it. I just want my husband to leave intact." The driver acknowledged and pressed harder on the accelerator, increasing the speed. I leaned over Alan's chest, pouring out all the words I hadn't had the chance to say in my previous life. "I know you're not dead, and I know you've been cheating for a long time. You staged this whole act just to run away with Irene, leaving me with debts. But I don't hate you. I've decided to respect your wishes. Since you want to die, I'll send you for cremation as soon as possible. I know you can hear me now, but I'm not sure if you can feel pain. I hope you can, so you can experience the cremation. After all, being cremated alive, you might be the first. You might wonder why I'm doing this? How do I know all this? It doesn't matter anymore because I've already experienced today before. In my previous life, I foolishly believed you, and it led to a very tragic life. So, don't blame me. Everything you're facing now is what you owe me." Alan's fingers trembled slightly, he couldn't move, but tears streamed down his face. I wiped away his tears and said, "Are you starting to cry now? You can cry later when you're in the crematorium." My phone kept ringing incessantly, calls from Daniel and Marian. But now, I was just a pitiful woman who had lost her husband, with no mind to answer the calls. With the driver speeding recklessly, a journey that would normally take half an hour was completed in 20 minutes. However, there were more people at the crematorium today, so it would take at least another hour for Alan's turn. I pinched my thigh, whimpered, shed tears, and found the person in charge. My husband suddenly fell seriously ill and passed away. My mother-in-law fainted upon knowing this and is in the hospital fighting for her life. I must return quickly. Please allow me to be cremated first. I don't want my mother-in-law to suffer anymore. The crematorium worker encountered this kind of person who wanted to cut in line for cremation for the first time. He hesitated a bit, saying, "I know you're in a hurry, but others have been waiting for half a day too. I can't let you cut in line." Although he said that, he subtly hinted by reaching out his hand, and I understood that he was asking for money. Knowing time was of the essence, I took out my phone and transferred 2,000 yuan directly to him. "Please help me, big brother. I'm an orphan, my husband and mother-in-law have been very kind to me. I really can't bear to lose my mother-in-law." With the money in hand, Alan successfully cut in line, and in less than 10 minutes, he was pushed directly into the cremator. The worker was about to press the incineration button, but I stopped him. I couldn't let him become a murderer, and I also wanted to take revenge personally. Upon my strong insistence, the worker agreed to let me press the button. At that moment, Marian and Daniel's anxious voices were heard at the door. "Stop, stop, don't cremate him." Marian might not have fully metabolized the drugs or might have been shocked. She directly collapsed at the door, saying, "Stop it, push my son out." Daniel grabbed my hand as I was about to press the incineration button. "Rachel, you. Wait, Auntie has something to say to Alan." Marian gasped. "Get away from me. I won't allow you to cremate my son. I'll do it myself. You guys, get her out." At this critical moment, the two of them still wanted to continue their plan of feigning death. I knelt on the ground and said softly, "Mom, Alan has already left. Let's let him rest in peace. I'm Alan's wife, and I won't leave." Our argument attracted quite a crowd. The workers looked at each other. What kind of melodrama are they playing here? The crematorium is not a place for your antics. As they were about to press the incineration button, Daniel and Marian threw themselves over to stop them. Their expressions were fierce, and the worker was taken aback and instinctively dodged to the side. Daniel and Marian couldn't stop their momentum and pressed the button, and flames instantly engulfed Alan. "Ah! Ah!" Two screams were heard, and everyone looked at Daniel and Marian, but I kept my eyes fixed on Alan inside the cremator. Alan must have been completely awake from the anesthesia. I vaguely saw him opening his mouth and reaching out his hand, but unfortunately, the commotion outside was too loud, and no one noticed. After a minute, everyone turned back to look at the cremator. The crematorium staff were surprised, pointing at the cremator and discussing quietly. "This is the first time I've seen someone's hand reach that high. It's really like a living person." Yes, before, there was just a slight muscle reaction. It's good that it's daytime. If it were at night, I would really think it was a fake corpse. I wiped away tears that weren't there, making sure not to let my mouth curve up, and said pitifully, "My husband was the best to my mother-in-law. He probably heard his mother-in-law's voice and wanted to sit up and see her one last time." I cried at the cremator, saying, "Honey, have a safe journey. Don't worry, I will take care of our mother. May you reunite with her soon." It was quite a coincidence that as I said these words, Alan collapsed. It seemed he was truly dead. I breathed a sigh of relief, and the suffering from my previous life seemed to vanish. Ignoring Marian, who was collapsed on the ground, Daniel stumbled over, visibly shocked by the scene inside the cremator. He desperately pressed the incineration button. "Why won't the fire go out? Put it out quickly." It was the first time the staff had seen a relative so agitated. They quickly pushed Daniel away, saying, "We understand you're grieving, but the dead cannot come back to life. If you keep this up, he won't rest in peace." "Yes, and we have a smart incinerator here. Once it's lit, it has to burn completely before it can be opened. Don't be impulsive." Daniel turned pale and sat directly on the ground, muttering, "It's over, it's all over now." Then he looked at me and said, "Rachel. We called you, why didn't you answer?" I sighed. I wasn't in the mood to answer the phone. My mind was full of Alan's passing. Besides, cremation after death is a normal thing, why did you try to stop it? Marian crawled to my feet and said. You killed my son, give me back my son's life. I sighed and held up the death certificate, saying. Mom, I know you're upset, but Alan's death has nothing to do with me. He passed away from a sudden heart attack, it wasn't my doing. If you don't believe me, ask Daniel. He was the one who tried to save Alan and gave me this death certificate himself. Right, Daniel? I turned to look at Daniel. Daniel had no idea what to say. Say the person didn't die? Then how did the death certificate come about? Say the person died? Marian wouldn't believe it. But as I explained, Marian understood. She suddenly grabbed Daniel's neck and said. It's you killed my son. My son was alive, why did you issue a death certificate? Now my son has been cremated, this is all your fault. I pretended to be surprised and covered my mouth. What, Mom, what are you saying? Alan didn't die? I turned to look at Alan, still being cremated, and exclaimed. No wonder when Alan was put into the incinerator, I thought I saw his fingers moving. I thought it was my imagination, but it was real? Hearing this, Daniel grabbed his hair and after much internal struggle, he said. It's true, Alan didn't die, he was just sedated. If you could wait a few more minutes, he would wake up. However, I wanted to make things even bigger. What? Are you saying Alan was cremated alive and conscious? This was too horrifying, everyone present was shocked. The staff's faces turned pale, muttering. That's why, just after the fire started, inside. He suddenly reached out. My God, this is murder. Marian, upon hearing this, rolled her eyes and fainted. I quickly realized what was happening and slapped Daniel. Daniel, are you crazy? Making such jokes? My husband is dead, why are you lying? Daniel was stunned. I'm not lying. I smiled. Not lying? Then tell me, why was my husband sedated, why did you issue a death certificate for him? Even lies need some groundwork. Daniel had no idea how to explain, and the surrounding staff thought he was joking and went back to their work. Seeing that Alan's cremation had ended, I left the crematorium with Alan's ashes, looking extremely angry. Before leaving, I left Daniel with a final word. You scared my mom for no reason, take her to the hospital. It's not that I didn't want to stay and watch how Marian would react when she woke up, it's just that I had more important things to do. I placed Alan's ashes prominently in the living room. Then I quickly contacted a lawyer to start the process of inheriting Alan's company, estate, and other matters. In my previous life, I was too sad, and by the time I realized it, the company was gone. If I didn't act quickly in this life, Marian would surely take over once she woke up. If I couldn't get it right this time, it would be as if I hadn't been reborn. After completing the procedures, I looked at the tens of millions of external debts and fell into contemplation. From my understanding of Alan, he couldn't have given all this money to Irene or Marian. I just checked, and there is no record of this money under his name. So, he definitely hid this money. Based on Alan's spending records, I found a garage he rented. I went to the address and indeed found this cash. I quickly brought the bank and loan company, paid off some interest, and cleared this debt. After doing all this, I lay on the couch, picked up a glass of red wine, and smiled at Alan on the wall. Honey, thank you. Now I have money, a house, a company, and no debts. I will live freely in the future, even more freely than in your previous life. I drank until I was drunk and fell asleep on the couch. The next day, I was awakened by a knock on the door. I rubbed my hungover head, opened the door. Outside were Daniel and Marian, along with a woman who looked a few years younger than me, who seemed to be the Irene I had met in my previous life. She must have recently given birth, her figure not yet recovered, holding a baby in her arms. The three of them looked sad, with heavy dark circles under their eyes, probably not having slept well for days, with several police officers behind them. Marian entered the house, pointing at me. Officer, this wicked woman cremated my son alive. Arrest her and cremate her too, let her taste what it's like. I had already anticipated this scene but didn't expect it to come so soon. I sighed. Mom, can you not make these kinds of jokes? I took out the death certificate. Officer, this is my husband's death certificate. My mom couldn't accept his passing and might have some mental issues. The officer glanced at the death certificate. Seems fine. I sighed and continued. I've been married to my husband for 5 years, our relationship was very, very good. I knew he wouldn't want his body to decay, so I cremated him immediately. Did I do something wrong? Marian clutched her chest tightly. Nonsense. My son had long been tired of you, this useless hen. You did this deliberately, you deliberately jumped the queue for cremation, you just want to get my son's inheritance and company. I confirmed with the company yesterday that you have no way to deny this. I looked incredulous and shed a few tears. Mom, you can scold me, but my love for Alan is real. If we didn't love each other, how could he make me the sole heir to his inheritance? Marian couldn't argue back. I paused and continued. You say Alan is still alive. Why don't you think, in such a big hospital, can't they even tell if someone is dead or alive? Daniel told me himself that Alan's brain died, his heart stopped beating. Who alive is like that? Marian gestured for Daniel to speak, but he just kept his head down. It made sense, if he admitted the death certificate was fake now, the consequences would be severe. It's better to leave things as they are. The situation fell into a stalemate. Irene tugged at Marian's sleeve, Marian fell silent, and she sobbed. Rachel, Alan isn't really dead. I am Alan's girlfriend. After I gave birth, Alan wanted to give me and the child a status, so he planned to fake his death and leave you, but he didn't expect you to cremate Alan directly. Irene hesitated. But Rachel, don't blame Alan. He did this just to avoid hurting you. He's a kind person. Now that Alan is gone, we just hope you can accept this child and let the child have the inheritance they deserve. I took a sip of water, imitating Marian's tone. Nonsense. Then I cried and said to Marian. Mom, I know you and Alan didn't have a good relationship. Alan didn't leave you a penny in his will, so you brought this woman from who knows where, trying to frame Alan, trying to get a share of Alan's inheritance, right? Marian was furious, but for the money, she held back. Nonsense, Alan and I had a great relationship. This is Alan's child. I'm crystal clear about it. I directly took out Alan's will. Mom, why are you lying? If you and Alan were close, why isn't your name even on this will? Why is all the inheritance left to me? Marian couldn't speak, Irene was still hesitating. After all, she couldn't just say outright that Alan made a will to make me shoulder the debt. I glanced at the baby in the cradle, sneering in my heart. I always wondered why my good husband of 5 years suddenly didn't want to pretend anymore. Turns out, it was because of the child. Even though Alan had promised me before our marriage that he wanted to be child-free with me, just 5 years later, his illegitimate child appeared out of nowhere. But I wasn't saddened by this. After all, I had already died once. I calmly said. Alan never liked children. We didn't have kids because Alan didn't want them. So, I won't believe it. If you claim this child is Alan's, then please provide evidence, like a legally recognized paternity test. Irene and Marian hesitated. There's no paternity test, but the child is Alan's. They both said. I waved my hand dramatically. Officers, can't you see what's happening? They know my husband has been cremated and are deliberately bringing a child to claim the inheritance. They're even falsely claiming I cremated my husband. But their words are full of contradictions. Marian anxiously said. I can have a test done with the child to prove I'm the grandmother, which indirectly proves it's Alan's child, right? The police shook their heads. That's not enough. It only proves a family relationship with the child, not with Alan. Even if proven, it doesn't confirm you and your husband had only one child. I stifled a laugh. In reality, one of the reasons I had Alan cremated was that I was worried he had an illegitimate child outside. Turns out, I hit the jackpot. Marian and Irene exchanged glances. Irene clenched her teeth. Regardless of whose child this is, Alan isn't actually dead. She cremated Alan, she's a murderer, she can't inherit Alan's estate. Irene's statement was correct, but she needed to prove I was a murderer first. I suddenly turned to Daniel. Daniel, tell us, is Alan really alive or dead? You're a doctor, you have a family, think carefully before you speak. You might not remember, but I do. It was you and Mom who pressed the buttons during the cremation. If Alan is alive, you and Mom are the murderers. I twisted their attempt to stop the cremation into a deliberate act. Marian hadn't even retorted yet. Daniel gritted his teeth, avoiding eye contact with Marian and Irene. He's really dead. I breathed a sigh of relief, but Irene raised her phone. I knew you would lie, so I brought evidence. Irene played a video on her phone where Alan, Irene, Daniel, and Marian were discussing faking Alan's death while sitting on the couch. Alan's voice came through the phone, just as disgusting as in the previous life. I'll take anesthesia, you find a way to make my wife faint, then tell her I've been cremated. Once it's done, I'll give you $1 million. However, the recording didn't include the part where they discussed how to make me shoulder the debt. Daniel crouched down, unsure how to defend himself. I didn't know. Irene seemed relieved. Rachel, I didn't lie to you. You really killed Alan, so you should go to jail. This inheritance should go to Aunt Marian. I looked shocked, didn't say a word, just wiped my tearless eyes with a handkerchief. After a moment of brewing emotions, I cried dramatically. Officers, I want to report a crime. These three deliberately faked my husband's death without telling me. I was so distraught at the time, I didn't even notice he had passed away. Pointing at Daniel and Marian, I accused. They knew I was going to donate my husband's organs, have him cremated, but intentionally didn't tell me he wasn't dead. They did this on purpose, wanted me to cremate my husband, then brought people to snatch the property. I turned to Marian and Irene, questioning them. I knew my husband had passed away, so I proceeded with the cremation as per the normal process. Did I do something wrong? Obviously not, the two of them didn't expect my speech to be so clear. They thought I would collapse if I found out about this, that I would be led by them. But I've already died once. I'm no longer the naive and foolish person from my previous life. The moment I woke up, I had already planned out how to navigate every step ahead. Tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled to keep them open. At that time, when I wanted to donate organs, Mom, you were there. Why didn't you tell me the truth when you refused to donate? If it was just about divorce, how could I have not agreed? It was all of you, deliberately deceiving Alan, making him believe your lies, choosing to fake his death. Then you intentionally cremated Alan, making me the culprit who sent her own husband to the crematorium. How heartless you are. Marian stammered. That's because Alan insisted on making you believe, so I had to stop you from donating organs and couldn't tell you the truth. I took out my phone. What about this? On my way to the crematorium, you called me, saying you knew I was going to cremate Alan. I was too heartbroken to answer the call. Why didn't you send a text instead? When we arrived at the crematorium, Alan hadn't been cremated yet. Why didn't you tell the truth and instead press the incineration button? Marian, Daniel, and Irene were speechless. But I knew they were confident they had time. As long as they could distract me at the crematorium and return shortly, their plan would succeed. After all, fortune favors the bold. The drama ended without a conclusion. We all had our own versions of the story. The police had to take us all to the station for temporary detention pending investigation. However, after a few days of investigation, they discovered that I truly was a simple and innocent wife, completely unaware of Alan's affair. I never questioned Alan's business trips or social gatherings, never checked his phone. They interviewed my neighbors, friends, and colleagues, reviewed the surveillance footage at Alan's home, confirming that we were a loving couple, never having any disputes. The police couldn't possibly know about my reincarnation. Based on the current evidence, how could a wife like me inexplicably kill her own husband? Marian, Daniel, and Irene's stories were full of holes. They had numerous opportunities to tell me that Alan hadn't died, but they chose to wait until after I cremated him. Especially Daniel and Marian, they both saw Alan enter the incinerator but refused to tell the truth, even pressing the button themselves. Although they claimed it was accidental, who would believe them? Moreover, the initial plot of faking Alan's death was already far-fetched. In the end, the investigation revealed that I was just a poor, innocent woman who had lost her husband. The other 3 were detained on suspicion of murder. 6 months later, they were convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Marian didn't have such good luck. Upon learning of her life sentence, she suffered a heart attack and passed away. Daniel's wife immediately divorced him upon hearing the news and took their child with her. It's said that Daniel, full of remorse, attempted suicide several times in prison but failed each time. As for Irene, she tried to contact me several times, begging me to visit her in prison. I ignored her, so she started writing letters, pleading with me for mercy, asking me to raise her child in memory of Alan. I replied with a letter, informing her that I had already sent the child to an orphanage. I'm no saint. I can't raise the child of someone who killed my husband. Afterward, I sold the house, using the inheritance Alan left me to buy a bigger, better located house. I've always kept Alan's ashes because I believe in spirits, and I want him to look down from heaven and see the happy life I'm living.